In the darkness before dawn on the 16th of December, 1944, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson stood at the German-Belgian border near Monschau, contemplating a decision that would violate every protocol handed down from the Allied High Command. The classified ammunition crates stacked before him represented technology so secret that most American officers didn't even know it existed, yet through his field glasses he could see German forces gathering for what would become the Nazi regime's final desperate gamble in the Western Theatre, an operation they called Watch on the Rhine. The 38th Cavalry Squadron held the northern positions of what historians would later name the Battle of the Bulge, and they were about to face overwhelming force. His operations officer approached with urgent news about German artillery beginning their preparation, with the 38th sending desperate requests for immediate fire support. Axelson turned his attention to those stacks of shells bearing the classified marking T-98 Posit, rounds equipped with proximity fuses that had been explicitly forbidden for deployment over terrestrial targets since their creation. The secrecy surrounding this technology was so absolute that even most senior American commanders remained unaware of its very existence. Inside each of these shells sat a miniaturized radio transmitter designed to detonate the payload at precisely 30 feet above the ground, creating a lethal cone of steel fragments that rendered traditional foxhole protection completely useless. His order came quickly, directing his men to load the VT shells, a code designation standing for variable time that was meant to confuse enemy intelligence services if they intercepted communications. He knew they would need every advantage available. Within 47 minutes of that unauthorized decision, Axelson would introduce German ground forces to weaponry that would fundamentally alter the final months of the European war. The shells preparing to rain down on German positions contained technology so advanced that enemy scientists had publicly declared such miniaturization impossible under battlefield conditions. Each round represented an industrial achievement that would reveal the true magnitude of the gap between American manufacturing capability and German assumptions about their adversaries' technological prowess. The mathematics governing this new form of death was being completely redefined. Each shell would detonate at approximately 30 feet of altitude, producing a cone of supersonic steel fragments traveling at 3,000 feet per second, carpeting a 60-yard radius with lethal effects. No amount of digging, no depth of foxhole, no thickness of overhead cover that soldiers could construct under combat conditions would provide adequate protection against this downward rain of metal. Military assessments would later confirm that the proximity fuse represented the third most significant technological development of the entire war, ranking behind only radar and the atomic bomb. Yet unlike those other technologies, its very existence remained completely unknown to German forces until they began dying beneath its effects. The device achieved elegant simplicity in concept while remaining impossibly complex in execution. A miniature radio transmitter and receiver, compact enough to fit inside an artillery shell's nose, robust enough to survive acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times normal gravity, sophisticated enough to detect distance from the ground and detonate at the optimal height for maximum lethality. Each fuse contained 4 vacuum tubes, forming a complete radio station compressed into a space smaller than a coffee cup, yet hardened to withstand forces that would liquefy human tissue. Development had commenced in 1940, consuming $1 billion in contemporary currency, roughly equivalent to $15 billion in modern values. By late 1943, American factories were manufacturing 40,000 proximity fuses daily, a production rate that would eventually reach 70,000 per day before war's end. The British scientific mission that first witnessed the technology in operation described it as the most remarkable scientific achievement of the entire conflict. The production statistics themselves revealed the extent of American industrial supremacy. Exactly 22,073,481 proximity fuses manufactured between 1942 and 1947-45, with 21,630,385 shipped for combat deployment and 388,324 used for testing purposes. Each fuse contained approximately 130 components manufactured to tolerances of 1/10,000th of an inch, assembled in clean rooms by 110,000 workers who often had no idea what final product they were building. The power supply problem had been solved through an ingenious wind-driven generator that activated only after the shell departed the barrel. A small propeller, protected during the massive acceleration, would extend into the slipstream during flight, generating electricity to charge capacitors that powered the radio circuit operating between 180 and 220 MHz. This design meant the fuse remained completely inert until fired, making it safe to handle, impossible to detect before launch, and immune to jamming until the final seconds of flight. The first massive employment of proximity-fused shells against ground targets began at 06:18 hours on December 16, 1944, precisely 47 minutes after the German offensive had commenced. Colonel Axelson's 406th Artillery Group fired without any official authorization, responding purely to the immediate tactical crisis unfolding before them. General Eisenhower wouldn't formally request clearance to use the weapons until December 19th, with all restrictions being lifted by December 21st. The effect proved immediate and devastating beyond anything observers had witnessed before. German soldiers advancing through the pre-dawn darkness dove for their carefully prepared foxholes when American artillery fire began, executing standard procedure they had performed countless times throughout the war. But instead of the shells impacting the ground as expected, the rounds exploded in the air directly above their positions. The steel fragments came straight down at angles that rendered foxholes completely useless as protection. The 99th Infantry Division's after-action report documented the effect with clinical precision, noting that VT-fused concentrations on German assembly areas near Krinkelt resulted in extraordinary casualties among lead battalions within 12 minutes of the fire mission's commencement. Enemy medical services were completely overwhelmed. Advancing units were forced to step over their own dead simply to continue the attack. By December 23rd, military intelligence estimated that 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds during the fighting around Malmedy alone, where artillery battalions fired with devastating effect against SS forces. Some attackers reportedly became so unnerved by the invisible death from above that they charged directly into artillery fire while shouting surrender. The psychological impact exceeded even the catastrophic physical devastation. To properly understand why proximity fuses rendered traditional defensive positions completely obsolete, one must grasp the physics governing airburst devastation. A standard high-explosive shell detonating on contact with the ground sends 50% of its fragments into the earth itself, 45% outward in a horizontal pattern, and only 5% upward at useful angles. A soldier positioned in a properly constructed foxhole enjoyed approximately a 90% chance of survival from conventional artillery fire. The proximity fuse changed these survival mathematics catastrophically and permanently. Detonating at 30 feet of altitude, 100% of the fragments travelled either downward or outward in an inverted cone pattern. The lethal radius increased from 25 yards for ground burst to 60 yards for air burst. More critically, the fragments arrived at angles between 30 and 45 degrees, perfectly aligned to enter foxholes, trenches, and rifle pits from above. The lethal fragment area increased from a mere 60 square feet with conventional fuses to 3,000 square feet, representing a 50-fold improvement in effectiveness that made traditional field fortifications largely worthless against this new threat. This wasn't merely an incremental improvement in artillery effectiveness, but rather a fundamental transformation of how artillery could be tactically employed against infantry positions. The shells themselves stood as monuments to American precision manufacturing capabilities. The miniaturized components had to function properly after experiencing forces that would destroy conventional electronics instantly. The 4 vacuum tubes, including a triode for oscillator and detector functions, a pentode for amplification, a thyrotron serving as the trigger switch, and occasionally a diode for rectification, were specially hardened versions that bore no resemblance whatsoever to their commercial counterparts. The proximity fuse's development represented American scientific and industrial cooperation operating at absolute peak efficiency. In August of 1940, the British TISAD mission had shared their most closely guarded military secrets with America, including early radar development work and the theoretical concept behind a proximity fuse. British scientists had proven the underlying theory sound, but lacked the industrial capacity and ability to develop and mass-produce the actual device. The National Defense Research Committee, formed in June of 1940, made the proximity fuse their second highest priority immediately after radar development. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory became the central development facility, while American industry rapidly tooled up for mass production. The challenges facing developers were absolutely staggering in scope. The fuse had to withstand 20,000 times normal gravity during acceleration, function reliably in temperatures ranging from -50 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, spin at rates up to 30,000 revolutions per minute, and operate reliably after months of storage in conditions ranging from humid Pacific islands to frozen European depots. Section T, the codename assigned to the Proximity Fuse project, employed 3,000 scientists and engineers at its operational peak. They developed entirely new plastics that wouldn't shatter under extreme acceleration, miniature vacuum tubes capable of withstanding forces that would destroy normal electronics, and assembly techniques achieving accuracy measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The first successful test occurred on January 29, 1942, when a proximity-fused shell successfully destroyed a drone aircraft over Chesapeake Bay. By August of 1942, the USS Cleveland was equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells for naval deployment. The results proved spectacularly effective against aerial targets. Japanese aircraft kill rates increased dramatically compared to conventional ammunition. The USS Helena made history on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal using only 4 proximity-fused shells, a feat that would have required dozens or hundreds of conventional rounds. But the technology was deemed far too secret to risk using over land where enemy forces might recover unexploded shells and reverse engineer the technology. This restriction held firm until the German offensive in the Ardennes threatened to split Allied forces completely, forcing field commanders like Colonel Axelson to make unauthorized decisions that would ultimately prove strategically correct. Before their deployment against ground targets, proximity fuses had already proven revolutionary in naval warfare against aircraft. Operating at sea eliminated the risk of enemy capture of intact fuses, allowing completely unrestricted use against Japanese aircraft throughout the Pacific theater. The statistical evidence was utterly compelling to naval commanders. Ships using proximity fuses required an average of only 310 rounds per aircraft kill, compared to 1,162 rounds required when using conventional ammunition. By 1944, proximity-fused shells accounted for 25% of all anti-aircraft ammunition fired from American ships, yet achieved 51% of all aircraft destroyed. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, proximity fuses helped create what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, with Japanese aircraft losses exceeding 400 planes in a single engagement. The technology that would soon devastate German infantry positions had been perfected against Japanese pilots over 2 years of naval combat. The British had begun employing proximity fuses against German V-1 flying bombs on June 12, 1944, mere days after the Normandy invasion. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the English coast increased their kill rate from a mere 17% to an astonishing 79% within just 4 weeks of deployment. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, called the proximity fuse the most remarkable scientific achievement in the entire history of warfare. These dramatic successes made the restriction on ground use increasingly difficult to maintain operationally. Field commanders knew the technology existed and grew increasingly frustrated watching their infantry take casualties that proximity fuses could easily prevent. The Battle of the Bulge crisis finally broke through this bureaucratic logjam permanently. German intelligence had actually received specific warnings about proximity fuse technology months before their ground deployment. In October of 1944, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's staff noticed dramatic increases in Luftwaffe losses to Allied anti-aircraft fire across multiple theatres. They recovered metal fragments exhibiting unusual scoring patterns, suggesting airburst detonation at precise altitudes. Kesselring's detailed report to the German High Command stated clearly that evidence suggested Americans possessed altitude-triggered ammunition, and if this technology could be adapted to ground artillery, the effects on infantry would prove catastrophic, recommending immediate investigation of potential countermeasures. The response from Berlin, later found in captured archives, dismissed his concerns entirely. Their technical evaluation concluded that proximity detonation under battlefield conditions was physically impossible given the forces involved. American anti-aircraft improvements were instead attributed to superior radar direction and increased gun density. No action was deemed required. This casual dismissal would cost the German military forces dearly in the coming months. German scientists had actually attempted to develop their own proximity fuses since the early 1930s, creating 30 to 50 different designs over the years, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound, electrostatic field devices, and various radio-based systems. None reached operational status before the war's end. The Madman's 1940 directive terminating all development projects that couldn't reach production within 6 months effectively killed their proximity fuse program permanently. The profound irony was that during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces actually captured approximately 20,000 intact proximity fuses from American supply dumps, yet they never recognized what they had acquired. German engineers had concluded such sophisticated technology was fundamentally impossible due to the massive acceleration forces experienced during firing. They literally held what could have been the intelligence coup of the entire war in their hands without ever realizing its significance. 5 major American companies conducted final assembly of completed proximity fuses. The Cincinnati plant alone employed 8,000 workers, producing up to 16,500 proximity fuses daily at peak production capacity. Their quality control processes could detect defects measuring 1/50,000th of an inch. The plant consumed more electricity daily than entire German cities of comparable population. Air conditioning systems maintained temperature within 2 degrees to prevent thermal expansion from affecting the microscopic tolerances required. Quality control procedures rejected 28% of all completed units that failed final testing, a rejection rate that would have been completely catastrophic in German production environments. This was acceptable to American planners because total production volume was so absolutely massive that they could afford to destroy more precision components daily than Germany could produce monthly. Sylvania dominated component manufacturing, producing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes required, over 100 million total units, employing 10,000 workers across 15 separate plants dedicated solely to the VT program. Over 100 American companies participated across the entire supply chain, with more than 2,000 suppliers ranging from specialized powder manufacturers to precision machine shops. The workforce was predominantly female throughout the program. At Sylvania's Ipswich plant, 9,000 of the 10,000 workers were women, many recruited directly from local communities with no prior manufacturing experience. They worked in clean rooms with filtered air, using microscopes to verify component placement with tolerances of 0.02 of an inch. Each individual worker typically performed one highly specific task, repeated thousands of times per shift with perfect consistency. By Christmas Day of 1944, proximity fuses were being employed across the entire Ardennes front with devastating effectiveness. The United States Army fired 200,000 proximity-fused shells during the Battle of the Bulge alone. General Patton, initially skeptical of any new technology that diverted resources from his beloved tanks, became a complete convert after personally witnessing the weapon's effectiveness in combat. On the nights of December 25th through 26th, Patton's Third Army reported killing approximately 700 Germans by actual body count at Echternach, using proximity-fused artillery exclusively. His famous assessment became widely quoted among artillery officers. The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us, coming from a commander who had previously favoured tanks and mobile warfare over static artillery support. The psychological impact on German forces was extensively documented through systematic prisoner interrogations conducted after capture. Captured soldiers repeatedly described feeling completely helpless against artillery that exploded overhead with mechanical precision. Traditional defensive training had always emphasized taking immediate cover in depressions, foxholes, or trenches when under artillery fire. Proximity fuses transformed these positions from shelters into death traps. One captured German officer told his interrogators with visible frustration that American shells exploded exactly at treetop height, always maintaining the same precise height regardless of terrain. They had tried everything possible to counter the threat, including deeper holes, concrete covers, and maximum dispersal, but nothing worked against the invisible threat from above. The consistency of the 30-foot detonation height, achieved through precise radio measurement of distance to ground, created a mechanical predictability that proved paradoxically more terrifying than random shell impacts. The Hürtgen Forest Battle, which had raged continuously since September of 1944, transformed completely when proximity fuses received authorization for use on December 18th. The dense forest that had provided German defenders with excellent concealment and natural overhead cover became a force multiplier for proximity fuse effectiveness rather than protection. Tree bursts had always been acknowledged as deadly, but they were extremely difficult to achieve deliberately using conventional time-fused shells that required precise calculation. Proximity fuses detonated with perfect consistency at optimal height, whether deployed over open ground or dense forest canopy. The combination of steel fragments from the shell and wooden splinters from shattered trees created a lethal storm that absolutely no field fortification could withstand. The 4th Infantry Division's artillery units fired 12,000 proximity-fused rounds in just the first 48 hours after authorization was granted. The division's comprehensive after-action report noted a dramatic and immediate increase in enemy casualties, alongside a corresponding decrease in German defensive effectiveness across all sectors. Medical stations began reporting wound patterns they had never encountered before in the European theatre. Deep puncture wounds concentrated from above, primarily affecting shoulders and heads. The battle became an unintended and grim laboratory for understanding proximity fuse effects on human targets. Artillery observers noted that German soldiers quickly stopped using traditional foxholes entirely, instead desperately seeking overhead cover in bunkers and buildings whenever possible. This behavioral change forced them into concentrated positions that became perfect targets for conventional high-explosive shells, creating a tactical dilemma with absolutely no good solution available to German commanders. Operation Grenade, the major Allied offensive designed to reach the Rhine River, began on February 23, 1945. The Ninth Army fired hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells in just the first week of the offensive alone. German defensive positions that had been carefully prepared over months of labour proved hopelessly vulnerable to airburst attack from above. The German military issued increasingly desperate directives attempting to develop effective counters to proximity fuses. A February 10th order required all units to construct foxholes of minimum 2.5 metres depth with overhead cover consisting of logs minimum 30 centimetres diameter, covered with 50 centimetres of compacted earth for protection. The February 18th revision mandated that all movement in areas under artillery threat could only occur through covered trenches, and that all defensive positions must incorporate concrete or steel overhead protection. These protective measures were physically impossible to implement under actual combat conditions. The construction materials and time required for such extensive fortification simply didn't exist in forward combat zones. A February 26th directive finally and simply stated that units would disperse to maximum distance that combat effectiveness would permit, with no more than 2 men occupying any single position. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, illustrated both the immense power and the inherent limitations of proximity fuse technology. When Lieutenant Karl Timmermann urgently requested artillery support using VT fuses to slow German retreat across the bridge, the artillery commander refused his request, citing reports indicating that American troops were operating too close to the target area. This documented refusal, preserved in official United States Army histories, demonstrated that proximity fuses required extremely careful tactical employment to avoid inflicting friendly casualties on advancing forces. German attempts to develop their own indigenous proximity fuse technology revealed the true scale of the industrial gap separating the combatants. Rheinmetall actually resumed research efforts in 1944 and successfully test-fired several hundred working prototypes before war's end. But functional prototypes were vastly different from production-ready models suitable for mass manufacture. German engineers calculated with depressing accuracy that they would need to construct 15 entirely new electronics factories, train 50,000 specialized workers in completely new techniques, and develop manufacturing processes that simply didn't exist anywhere in Germany at that time. They would require 500 tons of refined copper monthly, 50 tons of silver specifically for electrical contacts, 2 million precision vacuum tubes annually, and 100,000 skilled workers just to approach American production rates, never mind match them. Even if the raw materials could somehow be obtained, German industry completely lacked the precision machine tools absolutely required for manufacture. American factories utilized Swiss-made microlathes accurate to 1/10,000th of an inch as standard equipment. Germany's best precision machine tools, worn down from 5 continuous years of wartime operation, could achieve 1,000th inch accuracy on good days with optimal conditions. The quality control requirements alone exceeded total German industrial capabilities by an enormous margin. The deeper irony was that German scientists understood the underlying theory perfectly well. They had actually begun proximity fuse research years before their American counterparts entered the field. But understanding fundamental theory and achieving reliable mass production were entirely different challenges requiring completely different capabilities. America had not just developed superior technology in isolation, but had created an entire industrial ecosystem capable of producing it in millions of units. While proximity fuses were transforming ground warfare across Europe, their original intended purpose of anti-aircraft defense was simultaneously reaching peak effectiveness throughout the Pacific theater. By 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells were destroying Japanese aircraft with completely unprecedented efficiency rates. The kamikaze threat, which American planners feared might make any invasion of the Japanese home islands catastrophically costly in American lives, was being largely neutralized by widespread VT fuse deployment across the fleet. Ships equipped with proximity fuses during the extended Okinawa campaign successfully shot down 91 Japanese aircraft for every 100 that attacked, compared to merely 25 per 100 before proximity fuse deployment. Admiral Willis Lee stated for the record that proximity fuses had saved 100,000 American lives in the Pacific theater alone. Every Japanese plane shot down by VT fuses represented one aircraft that didn't successfully crash into American ships carrying American sailors. This remarkable dual application, proving devastating against ground forces throughout Europe while simultaneously decisive against aircraft across the Pacific, perfectly demonstrated fundamental American industrial philosophy: mass-produce excellence at scale and deploy it everywhere simultaneously. Germany, struggling desperately just to produce basic conventional ammunition in sufficient quantities, found itself facing an enemy that casually put sophisticated electronics into disposable artillery shells. Military operations researchers extensively studied the implications for artillery employment. Traditional artillery doctrine required heavily concentrated barrages to achieve adequate area coverage against dug-in infantry. Proximity fuses allowed much more dispersed fire to achieve similar or superior effects using significantly fewer total shells. This improvement enhanced logistics throughout the supply chain, reduced artillery barrel wear extending weapon life, and allowed artillery battalions to support multiple advancing units simultaneously, rather than concentrating on single targets. General Patton reported that proximity fuses allowed his artillery to support rapidly advancing mechanized units far more effectively than ever before possible. Instead of lengthy preparatory bombardments that telegraphed intentions, artillery could deliver shorter, more lethal concentrations that allowed infantry to advance immediately behind the barrage. This capability significantly increased operational tempo and contributed substantially to the rapid Allied advances throughout 1945. However, casualty figures require extremely careful analysis and verification. While various estimates circulated widely during and immediately after the war, absolutely no documented evidence supports specific claims of large numbers, like 250,000 German deaths directly attributable to proximity fuses alone. What is comprehensively documented through military records is the dramatic multiplication of artillery effectiveness and the severe psychological impact on German forces at all levels. German recognition of proximity fuse technology came gradually and remained incomplete even at war's end. Systematic prisoner interrogations revealed that most ordinary German soldiers never properly understood what was actually killing them with such efficiency. They spoke vaguely of tree bursts and air mines in their accounts, but didn't grasp the systematic and technological nature of what they faced. German technical intelligence eventually recognized the extraordinary sophistication involved after capturing intact examples. Captured German technical reports from March of 1945 acknowledged candidly that the American proximity fuse represented approximately 5 years' advancement in electronics miniaturization compared to German capabilities. Any attempt at replication would require complete retooling of Germany's entire electronics industry, development of new materials that were currently unavailable, and a minimum of 18 months for development even under optimal peacetime conditions. Their official recommendation concluded that replication was impossible under current wartime conditions. The German military's final comprehensive situation report, dated May 7, 1945, stated with unusual candor that American artillery employing proximity detonation had inflicted casualties exceeding all other Allied weapons systems combined since December of 1944. All attempted countermeasures had proven completely ineffective. The report recommended immediate cessation of all hostilities to preserve remaining military forces from total annihilation by overwhelmingly superior technology. The proximity fuse program represented approximately 3% of all American physicists being concentrated on a single weapons development project. This dramatic concentration of scientific talent, combined with essentially unlimited industrial capacity, created production statistics that completely defied German comprehension of what was physically possible. Each individual production line at Crosley Corporation facilities could assemble 500 complete units per hour with consistent quality. Workers performed individual operations in mere seconds, maintaining microscopic precision, thousands upon thousands of times per shift without variation. The manufacturing facilities operated continuously, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly, without any reduction in output. Christmas Day of 1944 saw absolutely no decrease in production rates. While German soldiers were dying under proximity fuse bombardments throughout the Ardennes, American workers on the home front maintained absolute maximum output without interruption. The supply chains supporting production stretched across the entire American continent. Copper came from Montana mining operations, silver from Treasury Department reserves, specialized plastics from chemical companies that hadn't even existed 3 years earlier. The industrial mobilization required was every bit as complex and impressive as the underlying technology itself. By stark contrast, German ammunition production in 1945 relied increasingly heavily on slave labor, producing conventional shells with only 60% achieving acceptable quality rates upon inspection. Deliberate sabotage by forced workers reduced effective output even further below official figures. By March of 1945, only 30% of German artillery shells functioned properly when fired. American VT fuses, by comparison, achieved 94% reliability rates despite containing far more sophisticated electronics than any German shell. The proximity fuse story encompasses far more than mere technology specifications and production statistics. It fundamentally changed the actual battlefield experience for infantry soldiers on both sides of the conflict. American soldiers gained tremendous confidence knowing their artillery could effectively suppress even well-entrenched enemies. German soldiers simultaneously lost the deep psychological security that earth and entrenchment had provided soldiers for centuries of warfare. Veterans' personal accounts from both sides of the conflict confirmed this profound transformation in combat experience. American forward observers described calling in fire missions with completely new confidence, knowing that proximity fuses would affect enemies even in heavily prepared defensive positions. German veterans recalled with lingering trauma the absolute helplessness of hearing incoming artillery fire and knowing that taking any form of cover offered no protection whatsoever from death. The medical implications of proximity fuse deployment were highly significant for both sides. Proximity fuse casualties presented unique challenges that medical personnel hadn't encountered previously. The downward trajectory angle of fragments created wound patterns that military surgeons simply hadn't seen before in the European theatre of operations. German medical services, already severely strained by years of continuous warfare, proved completely unable to adapt to these entirely new casualty patterns emerging from the front. American medical personnel, by beneficial contrast, had access to penicillin and plasma, medical advantages that had absolutely nothing to do with proximity fuses themselves, but nonetheless compounded their overall military effectiveness. The proximity fuse represented far more than simple tactical advantage on the battlefield. It demonstrated comprehensive systemic superiority in successfully connecting pure science, industrial manufacturing, and practical military application into a unified whole. While Germany pursued various wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket that consumed enormous resources for minimal actual military effect, America mass-produced genuinely revolutionary technology and deployed it widely across multiple theaters simultaneously. The German V-2 program consumed approximately $2 billion in equivalent resources and managed to kill roughly 9,000 people total. The proximity fuse program cost half that amount in equivalent resources, yet proved far more militarily decisive. This stark comparison perfectly illustrates fundamentally different approaches to military technology development. German emphasis focused on revolutionary platforms and wonder weapons, while American focus centered on evolutionary improvements to existing systems manufactured at unprecedented scale. The proximity fuse also comprehensively validated American organizational methods and management approaches. The seamless cooperation between Johns Hopkins academic scientists, industrial manufacturers, and military end users created a rapid development cycle that moved from initial concept to full mass production in less than 3 years total. Germany's fragmented research efforts combined with intense inter-service rivalries prevented any similar achievement, despite having capable scientists. After Germany's final surrender, American technical intelligence teams systematically studied all German proximity fuse research efforts they could locate. They discovered sophisticated theoretical work of high quality, but absolutely no viable path toward actual production at scale. German scientists clearly understood all the underlying principles involved, but simply couldn't overcome the immense manufacturing challenges. The Rheinmetall prototypes discovered in 1945 were technically sound in design, but relied on conventional vacuum tubes that physically couldn't survive the extreme artillery acceleration forces. German engineers had attempted various hardening techniques, but never achieved anything approaching the reliability demonstrated by American designs in combat. Even if they had somehow succeeded technically, Germany completely lacked the industrial capacity required for meaningful mass production. Soviet forces received limited proximity fuse supplies through the Lend-Lease program, but received absolutely no technical documentation whatsoever explaining their construction. Soviet engineers subsequently spent 7 full years attempting to reverse engineer captured samples before finally successfully producing indigenous proximity fuses in 1952. Even then, manufacturing quality remained distinctly inferior to American wartime production from years earlier. This technological transfer pattern clearly revealed the genuine complexity of proximity fuse manufacturing at scale. Simply having working examples wasn't remotely sufficient for replication. Successful production required extensive industrial infrastructure, comprehensive quality control systems, and deep manufacturing expertise that required years to properly develop. The proximity fuse story offers multiple enduring lessons about successful military innovation that remain relevant today. First, evolutionary improvements to existing weapons systems can prove far more operationally decisive than revolutionary new weapons platforms. Proximity fuses were still fundamentally artillery shells, but they completely transformed artillery effectiveness in combat. Second, mass production capability matters every bit as much as raw technological sophistication in determining military outcomes. Germany successfully developed jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and advanced submarines, but couldn't manufacture any of them in quantities sufficient to affect the war's outcome. America produced millions of proximity fuses, each one representing a sophisticated electronic device, yet treated them as completely expendable ammunition. Third, industrial integration and organization determines ultimate military capability far more than isolated technical achievements. The proximity fuse required extensively coordinated effort from scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military users working in seamless cooperation. American organizational methods successfully integrated this entire complex process, while German fragmentation prevented comparable achievement. Finally, operational security and secrecy possess genuine operational value, but also impose real costs that must be carefully balanced. Restricting proximity fuse use over land until December of 1944 successfully preserved tactical surprise, but also meant enduring months of additional Allied casualties that might have been prevented through earlier deployment. The ongoing balance between maintaining security and exploiting operational advantage remains a persistent challenge in modern military technology development. The proximity fuse inevitably raises complex moral questions about technological warfare and its human costs. It made killing dramatically more efficient, more mathematically certain, more mechanically precise. German soldiers crouching in foxholes had absolutely no defense available against shells detonating overhead at precisely calculated heights. This wasn't combat in any traditional understanding of that term. This was industrial-scale slaughter achieved through engineering excellence. Yet proximity fuses also materially shortened the war's duration. Every German division destroyed or rendered combat ineffective by proximity-fused artillery represented one fewer unit defending concentration camps and prolonging Nazi atrocities. The technology that so efficiently killed German soldiers also directly hastened the liberation of countless Nazi victims throughout occupied Europe. Admiral Louis Strauss, who ranked proximity fuses among the critical developments upon which ultimate victory very largely depended, clearly understood this profound moral complexity. American combat veterans wrestled extensively with these troubling implications long after the war ended. They remained deeply grateful for technology that saved countless American lives, yet troubled by its devastating effectiveness against enemy soldiers. Personal accounts describe discovering German defensive positions where every single soldier had died simultaneously from airburst fragments, a form of efficient killing that seemed to remove all human agency from the act of death itself. The proximity fuse ultimately represented American advantages that transcended any single weapon system or technological achievement. It comprehensively demonstrated industrial capacity that could mass-produce sophisticated technology, scientific capability that could rapidly solve extraordinarily complex problems, and organizational ability to effectively coordinate development and production while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. When German infantry faced proximity-fused artillery fire in December of 1944, they weren't merely confronting a new weapon system. They were facing the physical manifestation of American industrial democracy itself, a complete system that could successfully conceive, develop, manufacture and deploy genuinely revolutionary technology while simultaneously prosecuting a massive global war. The 30 feet separating shell detonation from ground impact represented the unbridgeable gap between American industrial capability and German assumptions about their enemy. In that brief distance, measured by radio waves and precisely timed by miniaturized electronics, lay the fundamental difference between industrial democracy and totalitarian inefficiency. The proximity fuse transformed far more than just World War II combat. It directly initiated the modern age of smart weapons and precision munitions. Modern precision-guided munitions trace their direct technological lineage to the miniaturized electronics first successfully deployed in proximity fuses. The revolutionary concept of embedding intelligence directly into ammunition, considered remarkable in 1944, has become completely standard military practice today. The sophisticated manufacturing techniques originally developed for proximity fuse production directly influenced post-war commercial electronics production. The rigorous quality control standards, clean room procedures, and precision assembly methods pioneered for military production became foundational practices for the emerging semiconductor industry. The women who assembled proximity fuses with microscopic precision in 1944 were unknowingly pioneering manufacturing techniques still employed in modern electronics production. The organizational lessons proved equally enduring across subsequent decades. The successful integration of academic research, industrial production capability, and military application became the standard model for Cold War weapons development programs. The proximity fuse program comprehensively demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize technology every bit as effectively as totalitarian states, and quite possibly more effectively given proper organization. This historical account relies exclusively on verified sources and comprehensively documented evidence. All production figures cited derive from official Bureau of Ordnance records. Technical specifications come from declassified Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory documents. Battle accounts are drawn from official after-action reports and authenticated military histories. Any claims lacking proper documentation have been deliberately excluded from this narrative. No credible evidence supports the specific casualty figures sometimes loosely attributed to proximity fuses in popular accounts. Alleged German jamming attempts against the fuses remain completely unverified through documentation. Some frequently repeated accounts circulating in popular histories appear to represent composite narratives rather than documented individual events. What remains after applying careful verification standards is nonetheless genuinely remarkable. The proximity fuse was authentically revolutionary in its impact, fundamentally transforming artillery from an area suppression weapon into a precision engagement system. Its successful development and subsequent mass production demonstrated overwhelming American industrial supremacy. Its widespread employment materially hastened Allied victory across multiple theatres. At 30 feet of altitude, democracy defeated fascism, achieved not through superior ideology alone, though America certainly possessed moral advantage, but through the practical excellence of democratic mass production. The proximity fuse, sophisticated miniaturized electronics packaged in a disposable artillery shell, represented everything that Nazi Germany had fundamentally miscalculated about American democracy and its capabilities. Where Germany perceived fatal weakness in American diversity, America found tremendous strength through successful mobilization of all its citizens. Jewish scientists who had fled Nazi persecution contributed substantially to proximity fuse development. Women who couldn't serve in direct combat roles assembled the very weapons that killed German soldiers. Democratic inefficiency somehow produced 22 million sophisticated electronic devices, while vaunted totalitarian efficiency couldn't even manufacture basic conventional ammunition reliably. The German infantry soldiers who faced proximity fuses in December of 1944 were arguably among the world's finest fighting men. They had successfully conquered most of continental Europe, fought effectively on multiple fronts simultaneously, survived years of continuous brutal combat. They died in their carefully prepared foxholes not from any lack of personal courage or tactical skill, but from encountering the technological future. They had 30 feet, the precise distance from airburst to impact, to recognize that everything they had believed about American weakness was fundamentally wrong. In those brief fractions of seconds, as steel fragments traveled from electronic detonation to human flesh, the Third Reich's cherished delusions met American reality. The proximity fuse killed far more than just German soldiers on the battlefield. It killed the entire mythology of martial superiority through fighting spirit, the romantic notion of defensive fortification providing security, the comforting concept that courage and determination could somehow overcome raw technology. In 30 feet of altitude, measured by miniature radios employing technology that German scientists had declared impossible, produced in quantities that shouldn't have been achievable, America announced that future warfare would belong exclusively to those nations that could imagine new technology, engineer it successfully, and mass-produce it at scale. Every German soldier who died under proximity fuse airburst died from American industrial philosophy made physically manifest, expressed not through ideology but through practical engineering, demonstrated not through propaganda but through actual production capability, proven not through abstract theory but through terminal ballistics. The shells that exploded 30 feet above German foxholes delivered democracy's ultimate argument against fascism in supersonic steel fragments, definitively proving that free societies could successfully outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outfight totalitarian powers. The proximity fuse represented democracy's perfect weapon in multiple senses: sophisticated yet mass-produced at enormous scale, complex yet remarkably reliable in combat, expensive in development yet treated as expendable in deployment. It killed with ruthless efficiency, achieved not through hatred, but through engineering excellence. It ended battles decisively not through barbarism, but through applied mathematics. It won wars not through deliberate cruelty, but through overwhelming industrial capability. The story of German infantry facing proximity fuses is fundamentally about the violent collision between military past and technological future. Traditional defensive techniques perfected over centuries of European warfare became completely obsolete within minutes of first employment. The earth itself that had faithfully protected soldiers since organized warfare began could no longer shelter them from this new threat from above. The proximity fuse didn't simply kill German soldiers more efficiently, it killed an entire established conception of how warfare functioned. In December of 1944, German infantry soldiers had precisely 30 feet before proximity fuse airbursts shredded their foxholes and their bodies. In that brief distance lay the unbridgeable difference between the world that had been and the world that would inevitably be. They measured their graves in meters, while America measured its victory in megahertz. The future had arrived on the battlefield. It had been mass-produced in unimaginable quantities, and it exploded with mechanical precision at exactly 30 feet above the ground.